Hi, my name's Mark, one of the pastors at Trillium. Last week we looked at Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 15, where he talks at length about resurrection. And Paul begins this section by reciting an early creed, an early Christian creed to the Corinthians. And that creed, if you remember, goes like this. Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, was buried, was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and then appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then to the 500, then to James, and then to all the apostles. Now, if you take a good look at that list of witnesses to the appearances of Jesus post-death, his raised status, who's missing? Who's missing from that list? And I would suggest you one major group that's missing are the women. The women are missing from the list. Where are the women? Why are they not included in the list of witnesses? Now, I'm sure some of the women are included in the 500. I'm sure that 500 includes a number of women followers of Jesus who met him post-resurrection. But what about the creed itself? Why are they not included in the creed? And I think the answer might be, well, they didn't get a specific appearance of Jesus given to them. I mean, Jesus might appear to them as part of the 500, but as a subgroup, they didn't get a specific appearance of Jesus granted them. But the only problem with that logic is that we know in the Gospel of John, that Mary Magdalene was the first witness to meet Jesus raised from the dead. She met Jesus in the garden before Peter did, before any of the disciples. She was the first witness. So shouldn't the creed have said, appeared first to Mary and then to Cephas, Peter, and then go down the list? Why is she not included in the list? And I think the simple answer is that the witness, the testimony of women in the ancient world was not taken seriously. That's just a fact. It wasn't taken seriously. In Jewish law, a woman's testimony was not sufficient in and of itself to convict. You needed at least the testimony of one man in order to corroborate the women's testimony. Otherwise, the charge was dismissed. And that's essentially true in the Gentile world as well. Women's testimony was not taken seriously. For the early church to have included the witnessing of women in the creed would have actually made their job of taking the gospel, the good news about Jesus Christ, out into the world that much harder. Women witnesses would have not added anything to the list and may have made it much harder. So then the question comes, well, how did they get in at all into the story? Why were they included at all? I mean, if the Gospels are simply made-up stories, yarns, folk tales, fairy tales, folk stories that have no historical root to them, then why would you include the women at all in the story? They do not help in the church's proclamation. Now, I think the answer to that question is quite simple. The reason they're included in the story is because they were there. They were there. They couldn't be excluded. And even though the early church's first creed did not include them in it, ultimately, over time, the full story got told until finally in the last gospel, the Gospel of John, the full story includes, of course, Mary witnessing Jesus first, raised from the dead. That's pretty remarkable when you think about it. How ultimately the full truth rings out, and we hear it today still ringing in our hearts and minds. That early creed that Paul recites actually rests almost exclusively on the testimony of women. There would be no creed of any type. There probably would be no proclamation of Jesus raised from the dead without the testimony of the women. How do we know that Jesus died? It's not from the men. They've all taken off. The disciples have scampered away. It's because the women were there at the cross when Jesus died. How do we know that Jesus was buried, as the creed says? Because the women were the primary witness to where Joseph of Arimathea had laid the body. How do we know that Jesus was raised from the dead? Because the women were at the tomb when the angels appeared and they heard the voice of the angel saying, "He has risen, he is not here." It's through their testimony that the disciples began to expand their understanding of what is going to unfold when finally Jesus reveals himself to them. The appearances of Jesus begin with Mary. Without the women's testimony, there is no story. And that story exists because the women really did witness the events that are listed with them. The gospel stories, I think, are an authentic and honest attempt to describe what really happened. And if that description takes within itself the challenge of explaining women's witnessing power to a world that was very, very skeptical, so be it. Thankfully, today we take women's testimony very seriously. What was once a hindrance to the church's witness to the resurrection of Jesus has today, the women's testimony, become our church's greatest asset.